Better get started. Thank you very much indeed to everybody for joining. Let me introduce myself. My name is Hugh Raven, and I'm the chair of the Moorland Forum. And this is the second of such events that we've done, an online discussion about matters of great topical interest to our members and others. Just a reminder, if you've just joined, if you wouldn't mind turning off your camera and ensuring that your microphone is muted, then we can hear from our designated speakers. And the format for today is that we've got a number of questions that have been submitted already, and we're going to ask our three speakers to respond to those. And then if we have time, we'll have an opportunity to respond to questions in the chat online. We're going to finish by 8 o'clock, or since we started slightly later, possibly, but don't worry, you'll get away in very good time. And we're going to produce a synthesis paper on the subject of Muirburn, and indeed covering the discussions that we had at Glen Mazarine Estate when we had a Moorland Forum outing a couple of months ago to the monoliths. We'll produce a summary paper, and that will be circulated to our stakeholders and a number of others, including attendees, MSPs, civil servants, and so on. And all of that, along with a recording of this evening's event, is going to be hosted on the Moorland Forum website. So if you want to see more, that's where you need to go. Our three experts this evening are Robin Pakeman. Now, Robin is a plant ecologist at the James Hutton Institute, and he leads the natural assets theme of the Scottish Government's strategic research programme. He has over 190 refereed publications to his name, so he's a very distinguished scientist. And he's in particular going to talk about the state of scientific knowledge on the impacts of Muirburn. We've got Dr. Emily Taylor from the Crichton Carbon Centre. Emily heads the centre and is an expert on environmental science and a particular specialist on peatland. And she's designed and delivered the peatland restoration projects across the southwest for almost a decade now. And she also delivers a popular programme of Peatland Action restoration training events throughout Scotland. And anyone involved in peatland management will know how important Peatland Action has become. And Emily comes from a farming background on the island of Coll, and in particular, her subject this evening is going to be peatland restoration. And Patrick Laurie is a farmer from Galloway, well kent to many here, I've no doubt. He's an author and a wildlife enthusiast. He's also a consultant with numerous estates, particularly down there in the southern upland, advising on integrated and sustainable moorland management for grouse shooting, agriculture, and the conservation of wading birds. I'm pleased to say Patrick's also a speaker at the forthcoming Tobermory Book Festival, where he and I shall meet again in late October. And he'll be speaking about his wonderful book about managing the hills of the southern uplands called Native. So we're going to start with questions that have been submitted by participants this evening. And in particular, I'm keen to get this one underway. So fire, let's talk about fire since we're talking about Muirburn. It's been used for thousands of years to manage vegetation, but it's become controversial in recent years. And as we know, the Scottish Government is intending to license it. So I'm going to ask you in turn, please, tell us about your thoughts on Muirburn as a tool for managing moorland. Does it still have a place in contemporary Scotland? Why don't we get underway, please, with Robin?
Okay, thanks for that one. My views on this are perhaps sitting on the fence somewhat, because the evidence allows me to sit on the fence because there's not really good evidence either way. And I say that because, and I said this at our meeting a couple of months ago, is that actually the science we've done over the last century on moorlands and Muirburn has kind of missed the point a lot, and we've not actually measured much of the right things, and we've only got a partial idea of what's really going on. So we can make an argument from a biodiversity point of view that it benefits some species and disbenefits others. and we can make a point of view from the carbon budget, is actually we don't really know very much about what's happening below ground, and we can measure what's happening above ground relatively straightforwardly. You know, you burn, the heather disappears and then comes back later. But we don't know what's happening to all the biomass below ground when you're burning. So it's a very contentious point. And I have to say, you can't really ask this question in isolation, because you have to think about the alternatives. We could mow the uplands, we could graze it. Mowing is pretty impractical, and you just end up busting machinery and losing tractors. Grazing, I think you'd be very hard pushed to find enough people willing to put enough animals out on the uplands these days to make a great deal of difference. So you'd have to support that by subsidy to get especially cattle back into the uplands to do a job for you. So yeah, I'm going to sit on the fence on this one.
Thank you very much, Robin. Let's see whether Emily's willing to take a shot at this one and perhaps give us a yes or no.
Well, I might be even more kind of nuanced than that. I would say yes in certain circumstances and no in others. I think the problem is Muirburn is not a standard technique with a standard outcome. We can't standardise it for Scotland. And in some places it may be appropriate, and other places it may not be. And I think Robin's pointed out the huge, the difficulty with the science is there are so many variables. Fire itself is highly variable within a fire, between fires, between hillsides in the same estate, between seasons, between years. The fire regime may be different. The kind of what goes on after fire will have synergies with how herbivores graze a site. So I think the answer is yes. I don't think Muirburn should be taken off the table as an option in some areas for the right reasons. I think how we go about implementing it and reporting it and monitoring it is something we need to focus on. But there may be circumstances where it is not appropriate either, and it's understanding these nuances and the complexity of fire as a treatment, as a management tool is really quite essential.
Can I come back to you on one particular aspect of it? One of the things that you're much involved in is re-wetting, and re-wetting, one assumes, makes it more difficult to burn. Can you just comment on that, the impact of re-wetting moorland, particularly peat, obviously, and the effect that has on not only its burnability, but on the characteristics of peatland that we want to encourage?
Yeah, so firstly, re-wetting is a term I don't really use anymore. I'm all about not drying. So it's not necessarily about getting lots of wetness everywhere and re-wetting. It's about stopping the drawdown of the water table and having these very dry events. I think, going forward, of course, we can do peatland restoration, and we've gone through some very dry, very hot weather, and our restored sites that are in good condition, they are very dry and they are vulnerable to fire. So I don't think it's a case of, you re-wet through peatland restoration and you create these lovely fire breaks everywhere, and it's not as simple as that. I think certainly having a diversity in structure and surface wetness is a good thing. So we don't have kind of uniform habitat, uniform sort of fuel loading across an area. So I think having these kind of breaks is very important. But we must not think of peatland restoration as the sole tool of managing sort of wildfire risk, particularly because, even good bogs can dry out and be vulnerable to fire.
Thank you very much, Emily. We'll come back to that subject, I think, in a few minutes. Patrick, over to you, please, on this question of whether Muirburn has a role.
Yeah, no, I think if you can hear me, Hugh, I think it certainly does have a role. And all I would do maybe is just not necessarily sit on the fence, because I think the others were qualifying their opinions. We weren't being asked, is there any place for fire? Is there a place for fire, was the question. And I think there certainly is a place for fire. It's back to lots of stuff that we've talked about, even at the event at Glenmatsran, that recognizing every piece of hill is different. It's unlikely we could achieve what we want to do without the maximum spread of tools available to us. So for me, it's a pretty clear yes on that.
Very good. Well, thank you. Can we stay with you? Because I know you practice in your own farm, not just burning, but also cutting and grazing. And talk to us about those as alternatives, if you would. And then we'll go to Emily and Robin and ask them the same question. So if you're not burning, are you likely to want to cut and you'll be grazing? What are the implications of using those techniques rather than Muirburn?
It's just such a massive subject, Hugh. And actually, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, I was involved in compiling a Principles of Moorland Management document, which was comparing cutting and burning. A lot of it felt quite new then, and I wondered whether or not that information, those comparisons, would be any more established now. They're still not. We're still pulling them apart, and the incredible complexity about what you achieve, what your end product is when you've cut a piece of heather as opposed to grazed it, as opposed to burned it. From a practical perspective, on my own place and working with the estates that I work with, there has been a bit of a shift towards cutting, even in the time I've been involved in this, the last 5, maybe 8 years, a pretty clear shift towards cutting. But I think most of that movement has taken place on the proviso that where burning is appropriate and when the weather is right and when the staff are there, it's an opportunity to get that fire in. And I think actually I wonder how much cutting would have been embraced and brought on if that kind of if it had been almost a stick rather than a carrot. So it's just quite interesting to see how that dynamic has shifted. And also, particularly here in the Southwest, we've got serious issues with kind of succession from, well, effectively a lot of moors, a lot of hills trying to get back into management, trying to get back into a cycle of management after a period of inactivity. That, to me, is kind of my day-to-day experience of moorland management at the moment, trying to bring places back. And that requires a very different skill set, a very different management approach from keeping a place in good order versus restoring it after 10, 15 years worth of lack of management. And for me, a combination of cutting and burning is really relevant for that restoration process. And actually more cutting, more burning might suit some of the more sort of maintenance tasks. So yeah, from a practical level, from a theoretical level, I'm afraid you're not being able to squeeze much sort of binary controversy out of any of us so far. All we've done is qualify and say, but we don't quite know. But I'm afraid I think that it just comes back to the idea that the more tools we have to manage these places, the better.
And presumably, just on the question of burning and cutting is necessary even when you are burning to ensure that if, for example, you're on the edge of a vulnerable habitat, woodland for the sake of argument, or vulnerable peatland, you will cut and burn to avoid burning, risking encroaching onto other habitats.
Absolutely, and certainly there's an additional flair of pleasant diversity that comes out of that, because then you've got nice stripes of different stuff coming around all your fires. I mean, it's lots of win-wins in here. It's just yeah, there's no one answer. In my mind's eye, I'm answering your question with a specific view on my small patch of the southern uplands, knowing that probably there'll be a whole dose of people listening to this just now who have a different experience on their piece of ground. Yeah,
very good. Well, you and Emily both said it's very specific to sites, so we generalize at our peril. Emily, over to you. These other two techniques that are used for managing moorland. Your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I think it comes back to, what is practical really for many sites. So, grazing, we suffer with very extensive areas of very uniform, low diversity structure and sort of bit heather. It's mostly kind of millennia we are dealing with down here, purple moorgrass. And so often it's been a case of, okay, look in the conservation handbook, what do we need to do? Oh, we need to get cattle on these hills and graze it with cattle. I've never yet come across a project or a site where that's been a kind of viable solution. It's a huge amount of resource. Often, will require an element of fencing. That's just not possible through many of the kind of support schemes through agri-environment. It's too costly. There's a real management issue there when we're kind of going to sort of grazing as an answer. I think kind of part of the problem with all of this debate around Muirburn is actually there's no simple answers. all of them take time and resource and really careful consideration. One thing is not necessarily easier than the other. It totally depends on your site. But I think the problem is we don't have answers. So we can't say, yes, cattle is the answer for that hill, don't burn, because it isn't. You know, that isn't working either. So we don't have a clear solution in many cases. So again, yeah, in some places it might be possible to cut, you know, if you've got the right machinery, the right kind of staff, that, you know, you need people to be able to do this. Likewise, if you've got a farmer who's very keen and actually really to put cattle in the kind of places that we're talking about, you need to really want to put cattle in these places, have the right cattle, have the time to do it, because this is not kind of easy farming, and it's risky as well for the farmer undertaking it. So I'm yet to find examples of where there's a definite clear solution that cutting or grazing is the answer over kind of Muirburn. I kind of think it's a combination of everything you need to be considering, and more likely not, there is not going to be a simple solution or a simple alternative.
Thank you very much. Robin.
Yeah, and just to highlight the fact that heather's not particularly good food for, you know, certainly not for sheep. Sheep can't really do well on it. Cattle will do okay, but only okay. So it's not really the place to put your animals if you want them to get fat. So you're then burdening the landscape manager, the farmer, the crofter with a landscape that they're not going to make a huge amount of profit out of if they're grazing cattle on their own. So it does need support to do that. And coming back to Emily's point about millennia and cattle, yeah, you have to graze it incredibly hard to make a difference, and no one is going to kind of mistreat their cows that much to just give them a millennia only diet for the summer. That's going to be a bit harsh on a cow, I think.
From the perspective, Robin, just to add to that, from the perspective of somebody who does mistreat their cows very grievously, it's actually really interesting. I've put the last 3 or 4 years, I've had cows on a fairly uniform piece of hill, millennia whitegrass heather mix. The cows have picked the bits they want, which amounts to about 60 acres out of those 200 available. I can't get them to go on to the rest of it. They won't go on to the rest of it. I put them on it, they come back off again, which leaves me with a management conundrum now. I can't fence them into the bit they don't want to be, because they'll sure as buggery get through that fence again.
Yeah.
I mean, it's back to this conversation about what's the one management tool to do this place. Well, part of me is now looking at that thinking I'm going to have to cut bits of that. I'm going to have to get into using other things. Cows are the answer, but they drew a line around what they were prepared to do. And the rest of it's up to me. I've got to dream up how else I'm going to get there. I know this is sort of a postscript to your point, but maybe it's just an example of from the practical perspective. I would love to think that it was an even tool that just, the cows will take care of that. The cows have a say.
But Patrick, you didn't tell us which 60 acres the cows are choosing. Are they choosing the millennia or are they choosing the heather?
They're choosing the millennia. Actually, they got really into the heather. I mean, this is, again, makes a mockery of some of the management prescriptions. The first year they went on, it was very dry for a period. They were able to cross a burn, after which point it rained. The burn came back up. They couldn't get back across. They happened to be trapped for that, whatever it was, a fortnight, 3 weeks on a piece of heather, absolutely destroyed it. And then since that point, have never gone back on that piece of heather, and it's coming back really nicely now. How do you manage for that? How do you predict that in the textbook before you? There's no way I could have foreseen that was going to happen. And actually, what was the most useful thing before I put cows on this piece of hill? I said, well, it's actually quite a big block and not very many cows. Shall I fence them into a certain part of it? And some of the best advice I received was let them go where they want, because if you put them in the bit where they don't want to be, your fence is going to be for nothing. So actually, I put these handful of cows in this big area, and now I've got satellite tags on them. I can see they're always in half a dozen places that I must say, if you and I walked across it before I'd started this, we would never have chosen those places, but those are the places they like.
And just finally, Patrick, thank you for that very interesting insight. You're not using the no fence technology? No.
I built, that was my COVID project. I took the lease on this place on March the 25th, 2020, and during the course of COVID, I built 2.5 miles of fence around this thing. So that was putting myself to good use during that period. But actually, I must say, it was a bulb and an electric wire. All the same cows have been in there each year. I don't even bother putting an energizer on the electric fire now. They don't even go near it. They know not to go there. They don't even try. So fine, perhaps, yeah, collars would have been maybe a better option. The GPS collars are very useful because when they're in bracken, you can be 10 feet off them and you wouldn't know they're there. So at least you know they're there.
You must have quite small cattle, if I may say so. Or the bracken must be, you
Big
must have allowed bracken to get very high.
Big bracken, small cows, but I'd like you to say that to their faces, Hugh.
At that point, I'm hoping to come and see you at some stage in Galloway, and I will perhaps get a chance to do so in person. Thank you. Can we move on to consider grouse? Because I know it's a subject of great interest to many on this call. We've talked about the different management techniques for moorland, and we've talked about Muirburn, and indeed it's often thought that the Scottish Government's intention to licence Muirburn is particularly aimed at grouse moor management. So can we hear your varying perspectives, please, on the different management techniques for grouse management, and in particular whether Muirburn is a much more valuable technique than the other ones we've discussed already. Robin, can we start with you if that's something you've considered, please? If it's not, we'll move on.
It's not something I've considered deeply, but if you think about it, grazing is probably not going to generate all that new growth that you want for the grouse to feed on. Whereas you could do it with cutting, but it works so well with burning. And you know, we're looking back over a century of refining grouse moor management, and I think they would have stuck with grazing in the late 19th century if they thought that was going to work. So yeah, I think you can rule grazing out as a good provider of feeding habitat for grouse, but it may be quite good for breeding habitat.
So the presence of sheep is entirely for other reasons than grazing management on grouse moors.
Yeah, I don't think it would contribute much to helping increasing your grouse density. It may extend the life of a new patch a bit by stopping the heather getting away.
Thank you.
I don't think that, as far as I know, there's nothing ever been done in the scientific literature on that.
Thank you very much. Emily.
Yeah, so I'm not a kind of grouse expert. I'm not a keeper. I don't really have a kind of practical understanding of it. But to me, just from my kind of observations, I can see Muirburn in more places. So I wonder if you can extend Muirburn, physically you can actually access bits of the hill easier, and Muirburn is something you can do across a wider area in smaller patches. So you have greater structural diversity over an area. I wonder, how far can you cut, just get machinery to the right sort of places as well. So I think, again, for me, it's about that structural diversity. Is really quite key as well, and I suppose that might be kind of easier to do with Muirburn potentially.
Thank you. Patrick?
Thinking again with my mind's eye in the southern uplands here, there's a lot of very grassy hills where grouse are being produced, very white sort of looking hills. It's been interesting working with estates who are looking to increase their grouse numbers on hills that you wouldn't necessarily say were heather hills. And really doing some great work with cutting and grazing alone, particularly in terms of brood rearing summer cover for young grouse. Some of these places are just absolutely fantastic. Whether or not the heather they have to see grouse through the winter is in good enough condition, I suppose is almost the opposite problem to maybe some of the that I've worked on in, say, north of England or actually in the northeast of Scotland, where there's much sort of greater heather dominance. Yeah, so I would maybe associate the grazing and the cutting with that grassier mix, and the fires more with the heather mix, just as winter feeding and winter cover. But yeah, certainly from what I've seen, if you can get in those whiter in that kind of whiter cover, where perhaps there's a very low percentage heather coverage, you can work wonders. You can absolutely churn grouse out on that kind of cover, provided your grazing's right and provided your structure's right. It's interesting, Robin, just to be clear, Robin, you're saying just there about not being a specific reason why sheep add value. Is that specifically almost sort of the nature of the heather itself? Because obviously there's structural issues, there's lots of subsidiary stuff about parasite control, there's loads of other issues, loads of other reasons why you'd want sheep in there. You're talking specifically about the nature of the heather plant, the productivity of that.
How the feeding resource is structured for the grass. Cool. So there's good reasons for arguing that the sheep actually a sort of magnet for ticks and reduce the tick burden on the grass. Again, that's a bit tested. But
I was pretty clear on your point. I just wanted to chase that up. Sorry.
Can we consider an alternative land use, which grouse moors are often considered to be threatening to their interest, which is afforestation? The soil scientists are clear that on certain upland soils, afforestation, either deliberate or by regeneration, is very inimical to the carbon balance. What do we know about the science there? And a secondary part to this question is where you have got regeneration, typically of non-native species, like, for example, spruce. It can be enormously expensive to keep Sitka spruce out of areas that are vulnerable to carbon loss through dehydration through trees. Any easy answers to these? I think we might start with you, Robin, on this one.
Okay. Well, there is some good evidence. So colleagues of mine and colleagues at Stirling, we've run a long-term experiment with trees in heathland. One of the sites at Bologie on Deeside is a really dry heathland. You know, there's no surface water, no sphagnum, nothing like that. And within, I think it was 15 years, putting in birch had more or less burnt through all the carbon in the soil. So what happens is the birch litter is really good quality, beefs up the microbial respiration, everything churns through, and your soil carbon kind of is frittered away really quickly. With Scots pine, it's roughly even. It doesn't go through the soil carbon as much, and so the above ground biomass that's put on is roughly balanced by the carbon that's lost. But that's a really dry one. As soon as you start getting into wetter systems, then that drying out, as well as the sort of microbial sort of stimulation, it will be even worse. And other colleagues here and at Forest Research have actually produced carbon balance maps for Scotland for different tree species. And the take-home message is trees are great in the lowlands for carbon, but either slightly bad or very bad in the uplands.
Just elaborate, because that's so counterintuitive, or rather that's so contrary to what many people think about the soil carbon balance, which is that through recycling nutrients, you can increase soil carbon levels in both upland and lowland soils by encouraging afforestation. That depends, you've suggested, on water availability principally.
Well, so what's happening if a tree goes into a bog and gets going, then it will start to dry the peat out, and then the peat starts to oxidize. And also the tree litter is better quality food for the microbes, and they burn through the carbon in the system as well. So it's a real big issue, and I suspect we've done an awful lot of damage to Scotland's carbon through our past planting habits and through our current planting habits. I've never seen that quantified, but it'd be an interesting one to do.
It'll be difficult to do it retrospectively, I suspect. And any thoughts about controlling spruce regeneration on areas that might have been, for example, grouse moor historically?
I think burning might be your best option. The cattle won't take it, and by the time they get above a few, tens of centimetres, then you wouldn't want to be trying to cut them.
Yeah. Goats sometimes can have a go at them. I've seen goats on Langham with the old Sitka spruce tree. They're quite good at climbing them as well.
Okay.
Emily, your thoughts on this one, please. The implications of woodland on upland soils and preventing regeneration by spruce or controlling it.
Yeah, so thank you, Robin, there for outlining the kind of background science in this. I think, you know, what woodland are you talking about? I think we also need to consider, you know, the commercial afforestation that we're seeing as well. And I think a lot of what we need to consider there is the ground preparation required. You know, ultimately we need to balance long-term carbon storage in our PT soils, and that's shallow soils as well, shallow peat soils, less than the magical 50 centimetres. This is long-term carbon storage. We're thinking we need to balance that against the kind of quicker term cycling of carbon we may see over kind of commercial forestry rotations. So yes, and I think there is absolutely a growing understanding that, you know, trees in the wrong place on carbon-rich PT soils is not good overall for carbon, and hence why we're seeing quite major programmes of forest to bog peatland restoration work. You know, that is possible, that is a viable kind of option. So I think we're seeing there's this growing unease about the kind of carbon balance of planting not just our deeper peats but our shallow peats as well. But I would definitely say, you know, we need to consider what we mean by woodland. But I would also say, you know, wet woodland is a very important habitat and ecosystem in itself, and there may well be a place for wooded peatlands, you know, that are functioning well in terms of ecology and particularly their hydrology as well. So we might not necessarily be anti-tree in certain places, but I'm sorry to say it, you know, it's the right tree in the right place, which is the kind of thing we hear everywhere, but it genuinely is. In terms of the Sitka kind of encroachment onto open areas of moorland and peatland, I would say this is a massive and growing problem for us, you know, facing restoration and trying to understand how on earth we manage these extensive areas. We have examples here in the southwest of designated areas, you know, big areas, 750 hectares or more, surrounded by conifer plantation, and this kind of scrubbing encroachment with Sitka, particularly some lodgepole, is a major concern. What we also need to think about is when we're destocking or we're removing stock, we're reducing stocking density, we're upping our deer management as well, our culling, we're looking at, you know, potentially culling goats, and you know, if we're taking off even the wild herbivores, what are the implications there for the regeneration of these conifers? And I would also say again that there's no straightforward answer. So you know, it can be about, well, we need to improve the condition of that peatland area. So, you know, grazing might be an alternative, or we need to look at kind of restructuring the sward somehow. Well, that can often open up areas and allow conifers to get away as well. So it's a very complicated one. And I would say it's becoming a concern for us because we do not want people to undergo, you know, peatland restoration, sign up to very long-term agreements for the management of this, and actually end up with a huge conifer problem on their hands, which is extremely costly and very difficult to keep on top of. So I would say it's a growing concern for us.
Thank you. Very interesting indeed. It's obviously a particular issue in the southwest where the increasing conifer plantation is enormously prevalent, but there are places in the Highlands, I know, where it's enormously expensive too to control regeneration of spruce, and there are no easy answers up here either. Thank you for that. Patrick, your thoughts on this one, please?
I would just say exactly what Emily said. It's from every angle is a serious and growing issue. I took a little piece out of our place 15 years ago, thinking it would revert into a lovely sort of piece of bog woodland full of alder and rowan. I'm now in a situation where every 2 years I have to cut all the spruce out of it. Otherwise, I don't know, like, it would be quite clear to imagine what it would have become. But actually, it's interesting, people who come to visit and want to look about the place, I explain what this project has been, and almost without exception, they are astonished that it's not reverting into an actual woodland. It's not becoming, it's progressing towards its sort of ecological climax. It's actually being weeded on a very frequent basis. Yeah, massive problem. Massive problem, and also a real, as you've said, Hugh, a real bugger of a job to do. If you're the one being asked to go and strip these trees out, you're not going to do it for. You're not going to do it. I don't think anybody here would be happy with that being their job for more than a week at a time.
Thank you. I would endorse that from my own personal experience here. And you mentioned lodgepole pine and Sitka spruce, and spruce is, I'm going to say, the biggest issue in Scotland. But here we have western hemlock as well. And let me tell you, when that decides to take hold, it's jolly difficult to keep on top of that, and I dare say there are other species as well. Can we move on to the question of licensing, please? It would be really interesting to get your thoughts on whether the Scottish Government's plans for licensing have pitfalls and hold dangers for the kind of beneficial upland management that we're all keen to see. And of course, there can be advantages. We know that in respect of, for example, wildlife persecution. But do you see dangers as well? Thoughts on that, Emily? Perhaps we can start with you.
Yeah, I think just the resource, the process, the paperwork, the administration. Is that going to be a major barrier to undertaking some of these management techniques that are working well in places? You know, we've seen the kind of situation where you have major kind of hoops to go through and major plans you need to pull together through kind of agri-environment schemes. And my experience is that people just don't have that resource or that willing to enter into these very long, complex processes. So I kind of worry on one hand, it might be a barrier to people because of the work required to achieve your licensing. But I actually see, from my point of view anyway, because I'm often seeing amazing things going on, and in general we don't know about them because, you know, oh, Muirburn burning, it's bad. You know, you do a quick Google search, Muirburn in Scotland, and it's not positive. You know, but actually you see it working well in places and you see really great practice. So if you could demonstrate that you're meeting the requirements for licensing and you have very good solid management plans behind that, justified, robust, well monitored, well, you can showcase that you are actually doing things right and well and getting positive outcomes as well. So I kind of see that there are two sides of it, but of course I'm not the one applying for the license. So I think, you know, I hope the process is not too lengthy and too much of a barrier to those that are doing, you know, good work. Thank
you, Emily. I'm sure Patrick will have a view on this, but let's go to Robin first to see if he takes a view on the regulation of Muirburn.
Yeah, my view is similar to Emily's. The fact that do we know how much resources Nature Scot are going to put into this? Because they do licensing for all sorts of other things, and I'm kind of aware of the license process for bats, and it's, you know, it takes a little while for you to get an answer back. And the thing about bats, it's time constrained. It's all summer work, but you know, and the same will be for burning. It's all very much in two small portions of the year generally. So yeah, I suspect it's going to be tricky. And
so
it depends how they
bureaucracy.
Yeah, and if you can apply for a 10-year license, maybe that's worth the paperwork. But if you're having to apply every year, then it's just going to drive both sides completely up the wall with the paperwork.
Thank you. Well, I don't think we yet know, do we, what the expectations are in that respect. But no, that's a very good point. Patrick, let's hear your views as somebody who might be applying for licenses.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one in as much as most of the people I know who burn and most of the people I work with who have fires will probably inevitably sigh and say, oh God, right, here's more paperwork to do. And whether or not additional bureaucracy is actually going to tighten up best practice, or whether these are the guys who are actually doing a pretty good job anyway, and they now more see this as being yet a further failure of trust with the kind of ecological direction of travel, whether or not it's another straw on the camel's back that just keeps pushing and nipping and nudging actually what Emily's identified there as being some really, really good things. Perhaps that's something that's failed to come out of the people who are actually lighting the fires, the positive news stories to push back against the negative. But in an environment where you know what you're doing is good, you know you're good at doing it, you know how it fits as part of a wider management plan, just slowly, bit by bit, having one hand tied and then the other hand tied and additional paperwork to do when you get back is just, for people who are trying to deliver their objectives here, it's just so soul destroying. It just doesn't. We've all lived through. I did my snaring ticket and my last, and things change all the time, and everything's forever moving about. It is just, yeah, it's just another burden to carry. And as I say, will it actually produce the tightening up effect that it actually desires when you quite often find that the fires that really hit the headlines and make the news weren't anything to do with any of these issues anyway, and came about through people who simply didn't even know that things could catch fire, let alone knew how to manage a fire. So yeah, maybe I'm perhaps sounding a little bit jaded here, Hugh.
Yeah, I think you are, as a matter of fact. So I might just have to put the other point of view, which is that as a prohibition to provide a disincentive to illegal behaviour, it's widely considered to have an important place. And you're as familiar with the results of the Werity inquiry as I am.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a really strong case to tighten stuff and to focus in on things. But I think what we're seeing, the uniformity of this is there is a relentlessness to this approach, which does feel like a boxing in. It doesn't feel targeted. It doesn't feel like we're focusing on what needs to be focused on. It feels like, if anything, it feels like a big oversimplification of what actually all we've done so far in the last 45 minutes is talk about how incredibly detailed this is. And then we're now talking about suddenly one piece of legislation that can make it better. That somehow seems slightly counterintuitive.
Well, we don't know yet, is what I would say.
No,
so we need to wait and see how responsive the Scottish Government is to the kind of points that you've all powerfully made and the responses to the consultation that they've widely undertaken. So let's wait and see what the legislation does actually propose. Also on Muirburn, we've had a question from somebody who's joined us this evening, Roger Cottis, who's asking about Muirburn and protected mammal species and the interactions of Muirburn with badgers and otters, for example. Any experience of how those interactions could be managed? Because there will doubtless be otter holts and badger sets on ground that is burnt with Muirburn. I see. I see. Robin is considering this one. No.
Yeah, just trying.
Got no experience of that then.
No experience at all, apart from the fact that these animals get a long way from where they tend to rest up and where they have sets or halts. So we had a project with dead deer staked out on the hill, and we had otters feeding on the carcass miles from where you would think otters would normally be hunting fish. And badgers roam pretty long distances as well. So I suspect they will be tucked away most of the time outside Muirburn areas. So I suspect there's no direct impacts. But what the indirect impacts, I don't know, because they could boost prey for badgers, make badgers easier to move through the landscape. I don't know. Not a clue, really.
Thank you. Emily, Patrick, any experience of these two mammal species and interactions with Muirburn?
But I kind of second what Robin was saying there. These species turn up in places you would absolutely not expect to see them. So I think having that kind of general awareness of what's around on your site, I think, you know, the kind of people undertaking good Muirburn are the kind of people that understand what they're looking at and would see signs of animals like this. I think I just want to mention there's a really good point raised in the chat. The other species we need to consider probably more are those that are not as mobile, adders and lizards, particularly. You know, so again, when are you doing your Muirburn? Can these species move away from the disturbance? But again, it's about that kind of structural diversity that you're creating, not, you know, uniform treatments over huge areas, kind of mixing up what you're going to achieve with your burn in terms of the structure is really important. That diversity is really key.
Very good. Thank you very much. Patrick.
All I can add probably is, having worked on a couple of wildfires in Galloway over the last 5-6 years, the number of amphibians and reptiles that get scorched was extraordinary. And being able to say this amongst friends, there was a one particular place where there was quite a big cluster of adders, and a little chance to have a taste of barbecued adder in the aftermath, helping the firemen. Actually, rather like a trout, I would have said, sort of something slightly trouty about it.
Thank you very much. That isn't something this evening, I don't think, but an interesting aside. You mentioned wildfires, and implicitly there's a distinction there between wildfires and Muirburn. It's implicit, but explicitly, clearly, there is all the difference in the world. But it's inevitable that we should touch upon fuel load, and it'd be useful to get your thoughts about controlling wildfire. And let me put it to you that Muirburn is often advocated as a way of controlling fuel load and therefore reducing the impact of the likelihood and indeed the impact of wildfire. Conversely, closed canopies, deciduous woodlands are, we know, very difficult to burn. And between those two habitat states is where the particular danger seems to lie. What are your thoughts about increasing fuel load and the role of Muirburn in controlling wildfire?
I'll just jump in really quickly on this. This is why I don't think we can move Muirburn from our toolkit in the future, because our uplands are changing. They're getting hotter, they're getting drier. The fuel loading, the structure, what is growing there will change. And I think, yes, Muirburn has to be kind of part of that overall management of wildfire risk. So we shouldn't remove it from our kind of toolbox, if you like.
Thank you, Emily. That's a very clear recommendation. Very helpful. Robin, your thoughts on this one, please?
Yeah, I think there's a kind of direct and an indirect effect. The direct effect is you are taking fuel out of the system, but whether that's enough to make a big difference is very difficult to know. But I think perhaps more importantly, the indirect one is, if you have a landscape with lots of Muirburn, you then have a lot of experts about how to work with fire and how to control it and how to push it in different directions. So actually, it's arguably that having that skilled workforce present may be the best defense against a serious wildfire. And in most situations, the fires tend to burn to a natural break, and it's perhaps more the initial ignition and the initial spread that we don't sometimes know very much about, that might be controlled in a situation with Muirburn. It might just not get going, but once a fire's going, it just tends to go.
Indeed, thank you. And we're seeing extraordinary levels of wildfire. A couple of years ago, I think we're all familiar with what happened in Sutherland and in Murray, which was pretty scary. Thank you. Patrick, your thoughts on this one, please?
Just very briefly, there was a big wildfire where some of my cattle are being grazed. I know Emily's been on the site quite recently, but it was interesting to see, almost as a case study. The fire was started on open moorland out of the burning season, end of April, beginning of May, burnt across open moorland, burnt through an area of recently felled forestry, really rushing through the brash that was left over after very dry conditions, then jumped to burn, got into an area of land that the Forestry Commission had allowed to naturally regenerate itself, so very low intensity willow with some spruce scrub in it. That was like fireworks going off. That was an extraordinary, with enough oxygen around those trees, they really did just go up like candles. It was extraordinary. And then hit a recently renewed forest track, which was being used to extract the timber before mentioned, and killed it stone dead. So that forest track, which I must say went on further on beyond to the point at which it had been renewed, the fire then crossed the bit that it hadn't been renewed at. So all it needed was a little strip of grass down the middle of the road so that the vegetation could fall across the tyre tracks into the middle, and then it fell on across the tyre tracks onto the far side. So largely off what Robin's describing there, these things do eventually find a buffer, whether it's a fire, whether it's a forest track, or whether it's a, I mean, I would have said a burn would have stopped it, but no, the stream was still going away underneath. So it was a real, for me, I've been involved in a few big wildfires. That one was by far the scariest one I've seen, almost because it was an opportunity to observe different types of vegetation burning with the same fire. And the helicopter, when it came, flew directly in a straight line down from Glasgow, and said, the man landed on the ground in front of us and said, I can't believe how bad that fire looks going through the forestry. And actually, because the insurance was only paying for the open hill, he then spent the rest of the day putting the fire out on the open hill. So it's just an extraordinary And as a result, actually, that fire then burnt on. When he'd gone away for the evening, it then jumped back across and caught the. So in terms of priorities, the strategic priorities, he was able to very quickly draw clever conclusions about what needed to come first. But there were other factors which dictated his priorities that day.
Patrick, have you ever seen wildfire affect mature deciduous woodland?
Never more than just around the edges. Never more than just around the edges.
I think that's an important point. Closed canopy deciduous woodland tends to have pretty high moisture levels, even in the driest circumstances, and consequently be much harder to burn. And in terms of fire stops, I'd be interested in your thoughts on whether any of you have seen the effects of beavers.
Oh. No.
Big wet areas should do, but yeah, I haven't seen anything like that yet.
Well, they are sometimes advocated as a fire control tool, insofar as they obviously hugely increase the wetted area around the burns that they inhabit, and consequently, in theory at least, there could be an impact on wildfire risk, but I wonder in practice whether it's ever really been observed. So good. Thank you. Can I ask you a question? Can we go back to this question of the carbon balance, please? We've got a question from our friend Tim Baines at Scottish Land and Estates, who points out that the research done from the University of York indicates that the longest term, the greatest benefit in long-term carbon populations of the three management techniques we've discussed, namely grazing, cutting, and burning, is from burning. Is that something that resonates with you? Robin, perhaps we could start with you.
Well, I'm suggesting the panel are completely the wrong people to answer this, because Andreas is in the audience, who did the original research. So.
Good point. Well, we have tried to get Andreas as one of our speakers, I think, and we're still working on that. So we'll doubtless hear from him in person in future. If he wants to put his comments in the chat, that would be helpful. So you've ducked that one, Robin, on the basis that there's an even more distinguished scientist who's joined us this evening, but not on the panel.
I hesitate to talk about somebody else's work when they're in the room.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, good. Thank you. Emily, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I agree. But I would say this is kind of the difficulty with the science around fire, is that, again, I'm sorry to say it, but every site, every fire regime can be different.
Yeah.
So it's understanding, how, because I think this is why we see such division in the academic literature that's coming through, is because there are different sites, different types of fire, different kind of frequencies of burning as well. So it's understanding, what is more normal, or what are the indicators for a fire that behaves like this, and what could be the potential outcomes of it. I think that's the big difficulty. So I think for everything you could say about one regime, you could kind of counter it probably with a study on a different site. But this is the thing; it's such a variable tool. It's we're talking about the wildfire now. That was like a raging animal, that fire across Galloway. And it's changing at the micro scale as well. So it's variable even within the same fire. So. Yes, I think it's great. The longer, I would say, what that long-term study shows is the need for long-term studies. We don't have enough of them up and running in the country.
Well, Andreas has just answered that very eloquently in the chat, so thank you. He's pointing out exactly that we don't actually have that really long-term study that indicates what I suggested might be shown by the science. Thank you very much. Another issue that's come up in the chat, which we perhaps have got time for just a moment, is the Mars bar test. And I've heard that put in an even higher value context as the mobile phone test. If you really believe that a cool burn is going to be cool, stick your mobile phone in the middle of it and set fire to it and see whether it's functioning at the end of it. Do any of you have any experience about cool burns and the Mars bar test?
I've never tried it, but yeah, you see it being done, and it's a matter of the fire goes through the canopy and doesn't burn the moss. That's what people are aiming for, and what people a lot of the time manage.
Very good, thank you. Emily, any thoughts on that? You're probably not involved in practical practical Muirburn experiments anyway, are you?
I'll disclose at this point, I did a PhD in Muirburn on blanket bogs, and part of that PhD was actually measuring the temperature within the canopy and down into the soil as well, into the peat layers. And it's amazing how, yes, in one area, depending on the kind of structure of the fuel in that very small, you know, half a metre area, it behaved one way, but next door it behaved differently. And so you get huge variation in temperatures. So I don't like the kind of cold burn, hot burn thing, because cold burns can be pretty hot. You know, it's about, you know, the impact on the soil, on the peat and the vegetation. That's what we should be looking at. We should be looking at intensity rather than temperature. So I get a bit fed up because I've measured the temperatures in a cool burn and it was pretty hot, although not deep into the peat itself. And I should say, this is where the kind of peatland restoration gets interesting, because sphagnum is an amazing insulator. You know, I was part of that PhD was, I won't rant on about my PhD, but part of it was literally blow torching the surface of wet sphagnum to see what the temperatures did below. And, you know, very quickly you get very good insulation if that's sphagnum. So I think, you know, the test is how wet is the surface? Is there good sphagnum coverage? You know, that would indicate you're going to get a less severe fire. But yeah, temperature is a bit of an odd one. Cool burn, hot burn doesn't really work when you're actually physically measuring temperatures.
Very good, thank you. Depends where you put your Mars bar, obviously. Patrick,
Yes.
your thoughts?
Yeah, be careful with that. Hugh, I would just exactly say again what Emily's just said, and in the aftermath, even if you're after a day's fire, even if you've been through a day's burning, you walk back through a series of different fires, you'll be able to spot places where you hoped that your phone might have been, as opposed to places where you're rather glad your phone wasn't. So it's not just as straightforward as that, but certainly working with Jeff Eyre in the Peak District burning over snow, that so happens that on that day in those conditions you were able just to skim the heather off the top and leave the snow unmelted underneath. So again, it's tempting to come up with a clean narrative on this, and also maybe slightly deceptive to do it as well.
Very good. Well, thank you. On that very nuanced note, I think that reflects well the nature of the conversation we've had so far. It is a very, very nuanced subject, and every area is different. And as we saw on our summer visit to Glen Mazarin, even on a relatively small piece of land, the circumstances across the hill at different altitudes, different water regimes can be so different. So it is difficult to make generalizations about this very complex debate. It's going to continue. Thank you very much indeed to our three excellent speakers, and to everybody who's joined us and put some really interesting and provocative comments in the chat. So thank you very much indeed for that. Just to remind you that this will go online if you're interested to have another look or want to draw others' attention to the discussion that we've been having, and we will be putting a paper about the subject on the Moorland Forum website in due course as well. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. I think we better wrap up there because I said we wouldn't overrun, and we have slightly, and hope to see you at a future Moorland Forum event, because we do get contemporary moorland management subjects out into the open, and they are unfailingly of interest. So thanks again for joining us, and good evening to everybody.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you.